Henry pulled open his barn door expecting emptiness, but instead stood frozen before a horse so massive she barely fit inside, 10 trembling foals huddled at her hooves. The fresh wounds on her body and the desperate plea in her eyes told him everything. She had escaped something horrific, and she was trusting him to save them. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning fog rolled thick across Henry Mitchell's farm, settling into every corner of his modest property like a heavy blanket that refused to lift. At 63 years old, Henry had seen countless mornings just like this one, where the mist clung to the fields and made everything beyond 20 feet disappear into a gray void. He had lived his entire life on this land, inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Mitchells had worked this soil, tended these fields, and cared for the animals that called this place home. But nothing in all those years, in all that history, could have prepared Henry for what he was about to discover on this particular morning. Henry pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out onto the porch of his farmhouse. The wood creaked under his boots, the same familiar sound that had greeted him every morning for decades. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and he could feel the dampness seeping through his clothes. It was the kind of morning that made his joints ache, reminding him that he wasn't getting any younger. His wife, Martha, had passed 3 years ago, and since then the silence of the farm had become both his companion and his burden. The animals were all he had now, and he cared for them with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. As he walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass, Henry noticed something strange. The barn door, which he always kept securely latched at night, was standing slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness marked the opening, and from within he could hear sounds that didn't belong. Not the usual shuffling of his 2 old horses or the soft clucking of his chickens. No, these were different sounds. Heavier, more purposeful. His heart began to beat a little faster, and a sense of unease crept up his spine. Henry quickened his pace, his mind racing through possibilities. Had someone broken in during the night? Were his animals in danger? He had heard stories from neighboring farmers about theft, about people desperate enough to steal livestock in the dead of night. But this didn't feel like theft. Something about the sounds coming from the barn felt almost peaceful, despite their unfamiliarity. He reached the barn door and hesitated for just a moment, his weathered hand resting on the old wood. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled the door open wide. What Henry saw in that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. Standing in the center of his barn, illuminated by the pale morning light that filtered through the cracks in the walls, was the largest horse he had ever seen. It wasn't just big, it was magnificent. A giant of an animal, standing at least 18 hands high with a coat that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. The horse's presence filled the entire space, and for a moment, Henry could only stand there, frozen in awe and disbelief. But that wasn't all. Surrounding this massive creature, scattered across the hay-covered floor of his barn, were 10 foals, 10 small, delicate baby horses, each one looking up at Henry with curious, innocent eyes. Henry's mouth fell open, and he took an involuntary step backward. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Where had they come from? How had they gotten into his barn? The giant horse turned its head slowly toward him, and their eyes met. In that gaze, Henry saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't fear or aggression, it was desperation, it was a plea. The horse's eyes seemed to say what words could not, a silent message that pierced straight through to Henry's heart. This magnificent creature was asking for help. Henry stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, taking in every detail of the scene before him. The foals were huddled close to the giant horse, some nursing, others sleeping. all of them so young they couldn't have been more than a few days old. Their legs were still unsteady, their coats still carrying that newborn softness that would soon give way to something coarser. The barn floor was covered in fresh hay, which Henry had laid down just the day before for his own horses. Now it served as a bed for these unexpected visitors. His two old horses, Bessie and Buck, were pressed against the far wall of their stalls, watching the newcomers with wide, uncertain eyes. Slowly, carefully, Henry took a step forward. The giant horse didn't move, didn't show any sign of fear or hostility. If anything, it seemed relieved that someone had finally found them. Henry noticed now that the horse's coat, though beautiful, was dirty and matted in places. There were small cuts on its legs, scratches that suggested it had traveled through rough terrain. The foals, too, showed signs of a difficult journey. Some had mud caked on their tiny hooves, and their eyes, though bright, carried a weariness that no creature so young should bear. This wasn't a planned visit. This was an escape. This was survival. Henry's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. He had lived in this rural community his entire life, knew every farmer within a 20-mile radius, and not one of them owned a horse like this. Such an animal would have been the talk of the county, impossible to miss or forget. Where had it come from? And more importantly, why had it chosen his barn? He thought about the stories his father used to tell him, about how animals could sense things that humans couldn't, about how they knew who to trust and who to fear. Perhaps this magnificent creature had sensed something in Henry, something that told it this was a safe place to bring its young. As he stood there, watching the giant horse watch him back, Henry felt a weight settle onto his shoulders. He was just one old man, living alone on a small farm with limited resources. He didn't have the money for a veterinarian, didn't have the supplies to care for 11 horses, especially not 10 newborn foals that would need constant attention and specialized care. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive and farming for over 6 decades, told him he should call someone. The authorities, maybe, or a rescue organization, someone who had the means to properly care for these animals. But as he looked into those eyes, as he saw the way the giant horse stood protectively over its foals, he knew he couldn't do that. Not yet. Not until he understood what had brought them here. Henry took another step forward, moving slowly, keeping his movements gentle and predictable. He had always had a way with animals, a patience that Martha used to tease him about. The giant horse lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. It was as if the creature was saying thank you, or perhaps, please help us. The foals, sensing their mother's calm, began to stir. Some stood on wobbly legs. Others nuzzled closer to the warmth of the giant horse's body. The scene was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the fierce love of a mother for her children and the desperate lengths she would go to keep them safe. As the morning light grew stronger, cutting through the fog and illuminating the barn more fully, Henry made a decision. He didn't know where these animals had come from or what had driven them to seek refuge in his barn, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not turn them away. Whatever had happened, whatever storm they had fled from, they had found sanctuary here, and Henry Mitchell was not the kind of man to deny shelter to those in need. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and began to formulate a plan. First things first, these animals needed food and water, proper bedding, and a thorough check to make sure none of them were seriously injured. Henry moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that sudden movements could shatter the fragile trust beginning to form between him and these unexpected visitors. He backed out of the barn slowly, never taking his eyes off the giant horse, and made his way to the shed where he kept his supplies. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered buckets, feed, and fresh hay. The reality of what he had discovered was beginning to sink in, and with it came a flood of questions that had no immediate answers. But questions could wait. Right now, these animals needed care, and Henry had never been one to overthink when action was required. When he returned to the barn, his arms laden with supplies, the giant horse was still standing in the same position, watching the door as if it had been waiting for him to come back. The foals had settled somewhat, though a few were beginning to explore their surroundings with the curious wobbliness that define newborn horses. Henry set down the buckets carefully and began to spread fresh hay in an empty section of the barn, creating a more comfortable space for the mother and her young. As he worked, he spoke softly, his voice a low, soothing murmur that filled the quiet spaces between the sounds of rustling straw and shifting hooves. "There now, easy does it. Nobody here is going to hurt you. You picked the right place to rest, I promise you that." Henry's words seemed to calm the giant horse even further. Its ears, which had been standing alert and attentive, relaxed slightly. The tension in its powerful muscles began to ease, though it never fully let down its guard. Henry understood that. Trust was not given freely, especially not by a creature that had clearly been through something traumatic. He filled one bucket with fresh water from the pump outside and another with grain from his limited stores. He knew his own horses would need feeding soon, but these newcomers took priority. Survival always came first. As Henry set the water bucket down within reach of the giant horse, he took the opportunity to study the animal more closely. Now that his initial shock had worn off, he could see details he had missed in those first overwhelming moments. The horse was a mare, her body still showing the signs of recent birth. Her teats were swollen with milk, and there were streaks of dried sweat along her neck and flanks. She had clearly given birth recently, perhaps within the last few days, and the exertion of caring for 10 foals was written in every line of her exhausted frame. Yet despite her weariness, there was a nobility in her bearing, a pride that refused to be diminished by circumstance. The mare lowered her head to drink, and the sound of her drinking, long and deep, filled the barn. She was desperately thirsty, and Henry felt a pang of guilt that he hadn't brought water sooner. But how could he have known? As the mare drank, several of the foals approached the bucket as well, mimicking their mother's actions, though they were still too young to need much beyond her milk. Henry watched them with a mixture of wonder and concern. 10 foals from one birth was virtually impossible. Horses typically gave birth to single foals, occasionally twins, but 10. It defied everything Henry knew about equine reproduction, which meant only one thing. These foals had not all come from this mare. The realization hit Henry like a cold wind cutting through his jacket. This wasn't just one horse seeking shelter. This was a mother who had somehow gathered orphaned or abandoned foals and was trying to care for them all. The thought was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. What had happened to the other mothers? Where had these foals come from? And what kind of desperate situation would drive a mare to take on such an impossible burden? Henry's throat tightened with emotion as he watched the giant horse nudge each foal gently, checking on them with the tender concern of a devoted mother. This creature wasn't just intelligent, it was compassionate in a way that humbled him. Henry spent the next hour moving between tasks, his body operating on the muscle memory of decades of farm work, while his mind struggled to process the implications of what he was witnessing. He checked each foal as best he could without getting too close and spooking them. From what he could see, they appeared healthy, though all of them were underweight and showing signs of stress. Their coats were dull where they should have been glossy, and their movements, while energetic in bursts, quickly gave way to exhaustion. These babies had been through an ordeal, that much was clear, but they were alive, and in his barn, and that meant Henry had a responsibility to them now. Bessie and Buck, his 2 old horses, had begun to calm down as well. They watched the proceedings with interest now rather than alarm, occasionally nickering softly as if trying to communicate with the newcomers. Henry made sure to give them their breakfast and a reassuring pat, whispering apologies for the disruption to their quiet routine. Bessie, always the more curious of the two, stretched her neck over the stall door, trying to get a better look at the foals. The giant mare noticed this and turned her massive head toward the smaller horse. For a moment, the two animals simply looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then the mare turned back to her charges, apparently satisfied that Bessie posed no threat. As the morning wore on and the fog finally began to lift, revealing the familiar contours of Henry's farm, he sat down on an overturned bucket and allowed himself a moment to simply observe. The scene before him was something out of a storybook, almost too perfect and too impossible to be real. The giant mare stood like a guardian, her body positioned protectively around the scattered foals. Some slept in piles, their small bodies tangled together for warmth and comfort. Others nursed, their tiny tails flicking with contentment. One brave foal, slightly larger than the others, had ventured away from the group and was investigating a hanging rope, batting at it with its nose and then jumping back in surprise when it swung. The innocence and resilience of these young lives struck Henry deeply, but innocence and resilience would not be enough to keep them alive, and Henry knew it. 10 foals required an enormous amount of milk, more than one mare could possibly produce, even a mare as large and robust as this one. He would need to supplement their diet with formula, which meant a trip to the feed store in town. That would require money he didn't have readily available, and explanations he wasn't sure he wanted to give. News traveled fast in small rural communities, and the moment Henry mentioned a giant horse and 10 foals, questions would start flying. Questions about ownership, about where the animals had come from, about whether they should be reported to someone. Henry wasn't ready for those questions yet, wasn't ready to risk someone taking these animals away before he understood their full story. He thought about his late wife Martha, about what she would have said if she were here now. She had always been the practical one, the voice of reason when his heart tried to overrule his head. But she had also been kind, impossibly kind, with a soft spot for strays and lost causes. Henry smiled sadly, imagining her standing in the barn doorway, hands on her hips, shaking her head at the impossible situation he had gotten himself into. But he also knew she would have rolled up her sleeves and helped, just as she always had. The thought gave him strength, a reminder that doing the right thing was rarely the easy thing, but it was always worth it. Henry stood up from his bucket, his knees protesting the movement, and walked slowly toward the giant mare. She watched him approach, but didn't move away. He stopped a few feet from her and extended his hand, palm up, showing he meant no harm. "Come on, girl. Let's see if we can be friends." The mare considered him for a long moment, her intelligent eyes searching his face as if trying to read his intentions. Then slowly, she stretched her neck forward and allowed her soft muzzle to brush against his weathered palm. The contact was brief, barely more than a whisper of touch, but it felt like a covenant. In that moment, Henry and the mare formed an unspoken agreement. He would protect them, and she would trust him to try. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Henry worked tirelessly, cleaning out stalls, spreading more hay, ensuring the barn was as comfortable and secure as possible. He brought out old blankets from the house and draped them over the wooden barriers to block the cold drafts that snuck through the gaps in the barn walls. He checked and double-checked the door latch, making sure it was secure but could be easily opened from the inside if needed. Every action was deliberate, every decision made with the welfare of his new charges in mind. By the time noon rolled around, Henry was exhausted, his back aching and his hands rough from work. But when he looked at the scene before him, at the mare resting peacefully while her foals slept around her, he felt a satisfaction that had been absent from his life for far too long. The afternoon sun broke through the remaining clouds, casting long shadows across Henry's property as he stood at the kitchen window, a cold cup of coffee in his hands. He had barely touched his lunch, his appetite lost to the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. Through the glass, he could see the barn, looking the same as it always had from the outside. But Henry knew that inside, everything had changed. Inside that weathered structure was a secret that grew heavier with each passing hour, a mystery that both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. He knew he needed help, but the question was, who could he trust? In a community as tight-knit as his, word traveled faster than wildfire, and the last thing he wanted was to draw attention to the animals before he understood what they needed from him. Henry thought of Doc Patterson, the veterinarian who had been treating his animals for nearly 20 years. Patterson was a good man, honest and fair, but he was also bound by certain legal obligations. If these horses had been stolen, or if someone was looking for them, Patterson would have no choice but to report it. The thought made Henry's stomach clench with anxiety. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of a truck engine rumbled up the long driveway. Henry's heart jumped into his throat as he recognized the vehicle. It was Dale Hutchins, his nearest neighbor, and one of the biggest gossips in 3 counties. Dale meant well, but the man couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. Henry watched through the window as Dale parked his truck and climbed out, adjusting his cap and looking around the property with the sharp eyes of someone who noticed everything. Henry set down his coffee cup and headed for the door, determined to intercept Dale before he got anywhere near the barn. "Hey there, Henry," Dale called out cheerfully as Henry emerged from the house. "Thought I'd stop by and check on you. Hadn't seen you in town for your usual Thursday supplies. Everything all right?" Dale's weathered face was friendly, creased with smile lines that spoke of a life lived outdoors. But his eyes were curious, already scanning the property for anything out of the ordinary. Henry forced a casual smile and walked toward his neighbor, positioning himself between Dale and the barn. "Everything's fine, Dale. Just been busy with some repairs around the place. You know how it is, always something that needs fixing." Dale nodded, but his attention had already shifted past Henry to the barn. "I thought I heard some unusual sounds coming from over this way last night. Sounded like horses, but different somehow. Bigger, if that makes sense. You didn't get yourself some new stock without telling anyone, did you?" The question was innocent enough, but Henry felt his pulse quicken. Dale lived a good mile away through the woods. If he had heard something from that distance, it meant the giant mare or one of the foals must have made quite a bit of noise. Henry scrambled for a plausible explanation, his mind racing through options. "Just Bessie and Buck acting up. I think there was a coyote prowling around last night. You know how horses get when predators are near." Henry kept his voice steady, hoping the lie didn't show on his face. He had never been good at deception, and the weight of the untruth sat uncomfortably in his chest. Dale seemed to accept this, nodding knowingly. "Coyotes have been bad this year. Lost 2 chickens myself last month. Well, if you need any help with anything, you just holler. We're neighbors after all. That's what we do." Henry thanked him, guiding Dale back toward his truck with subtle but firm determination. As Dale's truck disappeared down the driveway, Henry released a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. That had been too close. If Dale had insisted on seeing the barn, if he had caught even a glimpse of what was inside, the whole county would know by sundown. Henry walked back to the barn, his steps heavy with the realization that he couldn't keep this secret forever. But for now, for today, the animals were safe, and that was all that mattered. He pulled open the barn door and stepped inside, immediately feeling the tension drain from his shoulders as he entered the peaceful dimness. The giant mare lifted her head when she saw him, and Henry could have sworn there was recognition in her eyes. She knew him now, understood that he was the one who brought food and water, the one who spoke softly and moved slowly. Several of the foals were awake. their gangly legs carrying them in uncoordinated circles as they explored their temporary home. One particularly adventurous foal had discovered Henry's toolbox and was currently investigating a hammer with intense curiosity. Henry chuckled softly and gently moved the toolbox out of reach. "Can't have you getting into trouble now, can we, little one?" As he went about his afternoon chores, Henry found himself talking to the mare more and more. He told her about Martha, about how his wife would have loved to see these foals, how she would have already named each one and would be knitting tiny blankets for them, despite the absurdity of horses needing blankets. He talked about his fears, about the worry that he wasn't equipped to care for so many animals, about the guilt of lying to Dale. The mare listened, or at least appeared to, her ears swiveling to track his voice as he moved around the barn. There was something deeply comforting about having someone to talk to again, even if that someone was a horse. By late afternoon, Henry had made a decision. He would need to risk a trip to town for supplies, but he would go to the next town over, where he wasn't as well known. It would take longer and cost more in gas, but it would reduce the risk of questions. He made a list of what he needed: formula for the foals, extra grain, medical supplies, and vitamins. The cost made him wince when he tallied it up, but he had some savings tucked away, money he had been setting aside for a new roof. The roof could wait. These animals couldn't. Before leaving, Henry spent time observing each foal more carefully, trying to assess their individual needs. They were all similar in age, he guessed, between 3 and 7 days old, but they varied in size and temperament. The largest foal, the adventurous one who had found his toolbox, was clearly the boldest. It approached Henry without fear, sniffing at his clothes and nibbling at his jacket buttons. The smallest foal, a delicate creature with a white star on its forehead, stayed close to the mare at all times, venturing away only briefly before scurrying back to safety. Henry tried to memorize each one, their markings and personalities, feeling a growing attachment that both warmed and worried him. One foal in particular caught Henry's attention. It was standing apart from the others, not interacting much, and when Henry approached it, he noticed a slight wheeze in its breathing. His concern deepened as he got closer and saw that the foal's eyes were slightly dull, lacking the brightness of its siblings. This one was sick, or at least weaker than the others. Henry felt a surge of determination. He had saved many animals in his years of farming, nursed them back from the brink when others had given up. He would do the same for this little one. "You're going to be all right," he whispered, gently stroking the foal's neck. "I won't let anything happen to you." The mare watched this interaction closely, and when Henry looked up at her, he saw something in her expression that took his breath away. It was gratitude, pure, unmistakable gratitude. She knew her foal was struggling, knew it needed help she couldn't provide, and she was trusting Henry to give that help. The weight of that trust settled over him like a mantle, both heavy and precious. In that moment, Henry understood that this wasn't just about providing food and shelter. This was about saving lives, about being the difference between survival and tragedy, and he would not fail them. As evening approached and the barn filled with the golden light of sunset, Henry sat on his bucket again, watching the family of horses settle in for the night. The mare had positioned herself so that all the foals were within her sight, her massive body serving as both guardian and comfort. The foals huddled together in a pile of legs and heads and soft breathing, occasionally making small noises in their sleep. It was a scene of such perfect peace that Henry felt tears prick at his eyes. When had he last cried? He couldn't remember. But something about this moment, about the privilege of witnessing such trust and vulnerability, broke through the walls he had built around his heart since Martha's death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow he would need to make the trip to town, would need to figure out how to care for a sick foal, would need to continue keeping this secret from neighbors and friends. But tonight, in this moment, Everything was exactly as it should be. The horses were safe, they were warm, and they were together. Henry stood slowly, his joints protesting, and walked to the barn door. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. The mare was watching him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Sleep well," he told her softly. "I'll be back first thing in the morning, and I promise you, I won't let you down." Henry barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every sound from outside had him bolting upright in bed, convinced something had gone wrong in the barn. Twice he got up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness toward the shadowy outline of the barn, reassuring himself that everything was still and quiet. When dawn finally broke, he was already dressed and heading out the door, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. The world was still asleep, and Henry moved through it like a ghost, drawn to the barn by an invisible thread. Inside, he found the horses much as he had left them. The mare was standing alert, having clearly heard his approach, while most of the foals remained in a sleeping pile. But the sick foal, the one that had worried Henry so much yesterday, was standing apart and shivering. Henry's heart sank. The little one had gotten worse overnight, and he blamed himself for not acting sooner. He approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones, and managed to get close enough to feel the foal's body. It was burning with fever, its small frame trembling despite the relative warmth of the barn. There was no more time to delay. Henry needed to get those supplies today, and he needed to get medicine for this foal immediately. He quickly fed and watered all the animals, then made sure the barn was secure before heading to his old truck. The engine protested before finally turning over, coughing and sputtering like it always did on cold mornings. Henry patted the dashboard affectionately. "Come on, old girl. We've got important work to do today." The truck settled into a rough idle, and Henry began the hour-long drive to Millbrook, the next town over, where he hoped to remain anonymous. The journey gave Henry too much time to think. As the landscape rolled past, fields giving way to small clusters of houses and eventually to the outskirts of town, his mind wandered through possibilities. Where had these horses come from? The giant mare bore no brands that he could see, no identifying marks that would point to an owner. But an animal of that size and quality didn't just appear from nowhere. Someone had bred her, raised her, invested time and money into creating such a magnificent creature. And the foals, collected from who knows where, each one telling a story Henry couldn't quite piece together. Millbrook was busy for a weekday morning, and Henry had to park several blocks away from the feed store. He walked with his head down, hoping to avoid recognition, though he doubted anyone here would know him. The feed store was warm inside, smelling of grain and leather, and the particular mustiness that came from bags of feed stacked floor to ceiling. A young woman behind the counter looked up as he entered, offering a friendly smile that Henry returned nervously. He grabbed a cart and began working through his list, trying to appear casual while his heart hammered in his chest. The foal formula was expensive, more than Henry had anticipated, and he had to recalculate his purchases mentally as he loaded 3 large containers into his cart. He added vitamin supplements, electrolytes, extra grain, and then made his way to the section with medical supplies. He picked out bottles of antibiotics, antiseptic ointment, bandages, and everything else he thought he might need for the sick foal. When he reached the counter, the pile of supplies drew a raised eyebrow from the young woman. "Starting a breeding operation?" she asked conversationally as she began scanning items. Henry's mind went blank for a moment before he managed to stammer out a response. "Helping a friend. New foals." The words came out choppy and unconvincing, but the woman seemed satisfied enough. She told him the total, and Henry tried not to wince as he pulled out nearly all of his savings in cash. The money represented months of careful budgeting, of doing without, of setting aside every spare penny. Now it was going toward animals that weren't even his. toward a situation he had no business being involved in. Yet as he loaded the supplies into his truck, Henry felt no regret. Only a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. The drive back felt longer than the drive there, every minute stretching as Henry worried about the sick foal. What if it had gotten worse? What if the fever had climbed too high? What if he returned to find it had already died? The thoughts spiraled in his mind, and he pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the old truck to speeds it hadn't reached in years. When he finally turned onto his property and saw the barn still standing, still quiet, relief flooded through him. He parked haphazardly and began unloading supplies with an urgency born of fear and determination. Inside the barn, the scene had barely changed, which was both reassuring and concerning. The mare greeted him with a soft nicker, and the healthy foals stirred from their rest, curious about his return. But the sick foal hadn't moved from where it had been standing that morning, and Henry could see that its condition had deteriorated further. Its legs were splayed slightly, struggling to hold up its small body, and its head hung low with exhaustion. Henry set down his supplies and went immediately to the foal, running his hands over its too-hot body, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat beneath his palm. "All right, little one. We're going to fix you up," Henry murmured, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. He had helped deliver foals before, had treated sick animals, but never something this young and this ill. He mixed the formula according to the package directions, then added the electrolytes and a carefully measured dose of antibiotics. Getting the foal to drink was another challenge entirely. It resisted weakly, turning its head away from the bottle Henry offered. The mare watched this struggle with obvious distress, moving closer and nickering softly as if encouraging her adopted baby to cooperate. Henry tried everything he could think of. He dipped his fingers in the formula and let the foal lick them, hoping to get even a small amount of nutrition into its system. He held the bottle at different angles, tried warming the formula more, tried cooling it slightly. Frustration mounted as minutes turned into an hour, and still the foal had consumed barely anything. Just when Henry was about to give up and try again later, the mare did something extraordinary. She lowered her massive head and gently nudged the foal toward Henry, then nudged Henry's hands holding the bottle. The message was clear. She was telling her baby to trust him, to accept his help. Something shifted in that moment. The foal, responding to its mother's encouragement, finally latched onto the bottle and began to drink. The relief Henry felt was overwhelming, and he had to blink back tears as he watched the small throat working, swallowing the life-giving formula. It wasn't much, maybe a few ounces, but it was something. It was hope. When the foal finally pulled away, exhausted from the effort, Henry carefully wiped its mouth and laid it down on fresh hay he had spread specifically for this purpose. The little one's eyes closed almost immediately, and within seconds it was asleep. Its breathing still labored, but perhaps slightly easier than before. The rest of the day passed in a blur of constant activity. Henry set up a schedule in his mind. The sick foal needed to be fed every 2 hours, the other foals every 4. The mare needed extra grain to support the impossible task of nursing so many babies. Bessie and Buck needed their regular care too, though they seemed to understand that their routine would be disrupted for a while. Henry found himself running on adrenaline and coffee, his body operating on muscle memory, while his mind stayed focused on his small patient. Every 2 hours, he mixed formula, coaxed the foal to drink, administered medicine, and monitored its vital signs. By evening, Henry was exhausted, but there were signs of improvement. The foal's fever had dropped slightly, not enough to celebrate, but enough to give him hope. It had consumed more formula in the 6 o'clock feeding than it had in any previous attempt, and its eyes, when they opened, seemed a bit brighter. The mare had stayed close throughout the day, her presence a constant source of comfort for both the foal and for Henry. There was something profound about the way she trusted him, about how she had literally placed the life of this foal in his hands. As night fell and Henry finally allowed himself to sit and rest, he looked around the barn at this strange family he had somehow become part of. The healthy foals were playing, their energy seemingly boundless despite everything they had been through. They chased each other in wobbly circles, their tiny hooves clattering on the barn floor, occasionally nursing from the mare before returning to their games. The mare herself stood like a sentinel, watching over them all with an expression that Henry could only describe as maternal love. And the sick foal, wrapped in an old horse blanket Henry had found, slept peacefully at his feet. This was his life now, Henry realized. At least for the foreseeable future, his days would revolve around these animals, around keeping them fed and healthy and safe. It was exhausting and terrifying and expensive and complicated. It was also the most alive he had felt in 3 years. Since Martha's death, he had been going through the motions of living without really experiencing life. But these horses, with their impossible needs and their unconditional trust, had awakened something in him. They had given him a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning beyond mere habit. Henry reached down and gently stroked the sick foal's head, feeling the soft fuzz of its baby coat under his weathered fingers. "You're going to make it," he whispered into the darkness. "All of you are going to make it. I don't know where you came from or what you're running from, but you're safe here. I give you my word." The foal stirred slightly at his touch, but didn't wake, and Henry took that as acceptance of his promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, he knew that. But tonight they had survived another day, and that was victory enough. 3 days passed in a rhythm of feeding, cleaning, and watching. 3 days during which Henry barely left the barn except to sleep a few restless hours in his house before returning at dawn. The sick foal was improving, slowly but steadily. Its fever had broken on the 2nd day, and by the 3rd morning, it was standing on its own, without the trembling that had marked its first days. Henry had taken to calling it Hope, though he spoke the name only in whispers, afraid that giving it a name would make the loss too painful if the worst happened. But Hope was fighting, and with each small victory, Henry's own hope grew stronger. The other foals were thriving under Henry's care, their personalities emerging more distinctly with each passing day. The adventurous one, which Henry had started calling Scout in his mind, was constantly exploring every corner of the barn. A coal-black foal with a defiant spirit had earned the name Shadow, for the way it seemed to appear suddenly from dark corners. The smallest one with the white star he called Stella, and she remained the shyest of the group, though she had begun to approach Henry when he brought food. Each foal was becoming an individual in his eyes, no longer just anonymous babies, but distinct souls with their own quirks and characteristics. The giant mare had accepted Henry completely into her circle. She no longer tensed when he approached, no longer watched him with that initial wariness. Instead, she would greet him with a soft nicker each morning, and sometimes she would rest her enormous head on his shoulder while he worked, a gesture so trusting and affectionate that it never failed to move him. Henry had taken to calling her Grace, because there was something graceful about the way she moved despite her size, and because she had shown him grace by trusting a stranger with her precious family. But the peace of those 3 days couldn't last forever. On the 4th morning, Henry was in the barn mixing formula when he heard the sound of multiple vehicles coming up his driveway. His blood ran cold. He set down the bottle and moved quickly to the barn door, closing it firmly behind him as he stepped outside. 3 trucks were parked in his yard, and from them emerged 5 men, all wearing the uniforms of the county animal control. Leading them was Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Henry had known for 30 years, and the expression on Tom's weathered face was apologetic but determined. "Henry," Tom began, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to talk. Someone reported that you might have some horses here that don't belong to you. Now, I told them that didn't sound like you, but I have to follow up on the complaint. "Do you mind if we take a look around?" Henry's mind raced. He couldn't refuse without making himself look guilty, but letting them see what was in the barn would mean losing everything. The horses would be taken away, put into the system, separated. Grace would lose her foals. The sick one might not survive the stress of being moved. He couldn't let that happen. "Tom, I don't know what you heard, but I've just got Bessie and Buck in there, same as always." Henry kept his voice steady, hating the lie but seeing no other choice. The sheriff looked at him for a long moment, and Henry could see the conflict in his old friend's eyes. Tom wanted to believe him, wanted to just turn around and leave, but duty was duty, and there were witnesses now. "I'm sorry, Henry, but I need to see for myself. It'll just take a minute, and then we can all go home." The other men were already moving toward the barn, and Henry knew his time had run out. As they reached the barn door, Henry made a decision born of desperation. He stepped in front of the door, blocking their path. "Before you go in there, you need to understand something. Whatever you find in there, those animals are under my protection. They came to me seeking shelter, and I won't let them be taken away to some facility where they'll be scared and alone." His voice shook with emotion, all pretense of calm abandoned. Tom's expression shifted from apologetic to concerned. "Henry, what's going on? What's in that barn?" Before Henry could answer, a sound came from inside the barn. It was Grace calling out as if she sensed the danger. The sound was unlike anything the men had heard before, deeper and more resonant than a normal horse's neigh. It carried through the walls of the barn and seemed to vibrate in the air around them. The animal control officers exchanged glances, and one of them reached for the barn door. Henry's hand shot out and grabbed the man's wrist. "Please," Henry said, his voice breaking. "Please, just give me a chance to explain." But the officer shook off his grip and pulled open the barn door. What happened next would be talked about in the county for years to come. As the door swung wide, revealing the interior of the barn, all 5 men stopped dead in their tracks. There, in the golden light streaming through the barn's high windows, stood Grace in all her magnificent glory. She was even more impressive when first seen, her size made more dramatic by the comparison to the 10 foals scattered around her feet. The foals, startled by the sudden intrusion and the presence of strangers, scrambled to hide behind their massive protector. Grace herself stood firm, placing her body between the men and her babies, her eyes blazing with a mother's fierce protectiveness. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The men simply stared, trying to process what they were seeing. Finally, Tom found his voice. "Henry, what in God's name? Where did they come from?" Henry stepped forward, moving slowly so as not to spook Grace or the foals. "I found them here 4 days ago. They showed up in my barn, and the mare, she was desperate. You can see it in her eyes. Something happened to her, something that made her gather these foals and run. I don't know the whole story, but I know she needs help. They all do. One of them was sick, would have died if I hadn't treated it. I couldn't just turn them away." One of the animal control officers stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "These animals need to be reported. They could be stolen property. Someone is probably looking for them. We need to take them into custody and figure out where they belong." The words sent a spike of panic through Henry's chest. "No," he said firmly, "they belong here. Grace chose this place as a sanctuary, and I won't let you take that away from her." Tom put a hand on his shoulder, his grip gentle but his voice serious. "Henry, I understand what you're trying to do, but this is bigger than just you and these horses. We have protocols to follow." Grace, sensing the tension in the air, stamped her massive hoof against the barn floor. The sound echoed like thunder, and the foals pressed closer to her legs. Henry saw hope among them, still thinner than the others, but standing on its own now, looking at him with those trusting eyes. In that moment, Henry knew he would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant fighting the law itself. "These horses are not leaving this barn," he said quietly. "Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You'll have to arrest me first." The standoff that followed was tense and uncomfortable. The animal control officers looked to Tom for guidance, and the sheriff seemed torn between his friendship with Henry and his duty to uphold the law. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom sighed heavily. "All right, Henry, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you 72 hours to sort this out. You need to contact a vet, get these animals properly examined and documented. You need to file the appropriate paperwork claiming them as found animals, and you need to pray that nobody comes forward in that time claiming ownership. If someone does, there's nothing I can do to help you." Henry nodded, relief washing over him so powerfully he felt his knees weaken. "Thank you, Tom. I won't forget this." The sheriff shook his head slowly. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over, not by a long shot." He turned to the animal control officers. "Let's go. We'll come back in 3 days to check on the situation." As the men filed out of the barn, each of them took one last look at Grace and her foals, their expressions a mixture of amazement and disbelief. When they were gone, Henry closed the barn door and leaned against it, his heart still pounding. Grace approached him slowly, and when she reached him, she lowered her head and pressed it gently against his chest. Henry wrapped his arms around her neck, feeling the warmth of her body, the steady beat of her heart. "We've got 3 days," he whispered into her mane. 3 days to figure this out." But he had no idea where to even start. As he stood there in the quiet barn, surrounded by the animals he had sworn to protect, Henry realized that the real battle was just beginning. Someone had reported him, which meant someone was watching, and if the horse's original owner discovered where they were, no amount of determination would be enough to keep them safe. Henry spent the rest of that day making phone calls, his old rotary phone feeling heavy in his hand with each turn of the dial. The first call was to Doc Patterson, who listened to Henry's story in silence before agreeing to come out the following morning. The veterinarian's voice had been cautious, professional, but Henry could hear the curiosity underneath. A giant mare and 10 foals didn't show up every day, and Patterson, for all his years of experience, had never encountered anything quite like what Henry was describing. The paperwork was another matter entirely. Henry drove back to town, this time to his own small community, no longer worried about being seen. The secret was out anyway. At the county clerk's office, a thin woman with reading glasses perched on her nose looked at him with thinly veiled skepticism as he filled out the found animal report. She kept asking questions he couldn't answer. "Where exactly did you find them? Do you have any identifying information? Have you checked for microchips or brands?" Each question felt like an accusation, and Henry's hand shook as he signed the forms. The woman took the papers with a sniff and told him he would be contacted if anyone claimed the animals. When Henry returned home, he found Dale Hutchins waiting in his driveway. The neighboring farmer was leaning against his truck, arms crossed, and his expression was difficult to read. Henry's stomach dropped. Had Dale been the one to report him? As he climbed out of his truck, Dale pushed off from his vehicle and walked toward him. "Word travels fast around here, Henry," Dale said without preamble. "The whole county's talking about the horses you've got hidden in your barn." Henry waited, unsure whether to defend himself or apologize or explain. He settled for silence. Dale continued, his weathered face serious. "I heard Tom Bradley was out here with animal control. I heard they wanted to take those horses away." Henry nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "That's right. They gave me 72 hours to sort things out." Dale was quiet for a moment, looking past Henry toward the barn. Then he did something that shocked Henry to his core. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is everything I made selling my corn crop this season. It's not much, but it's yours if you need it to fight for those horses." Henry stared at the envelope, unable to find words. He and Dale had been neighbors for decades, friendly but not close. They borrowed tools from each other, helped with heavy lifting when needed. But this was something else entirely. This was generosity that went beyond neighborly duty. "I can't take your money, Dale," Henry finally managed to say. Dale pressed the envelope into Henry's hands. "Yes, you can. I've known you all my life, Henry Mitchell. You're the most decent man in this county. And if you say those horses need protecting, then I believe you. Besides, my wife heard about that sick foal you've been nursing. She said any man who would do that deserves help." The envelope felt heavy in Henry's hands, heavy with more than just money. It was heavy with trust, with community, with the realization that he wasn't as alone as he thought. "Thank you," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. Dale nodded once, climbed back into his truck, and drove away without another word. Henry stood in his driveway for a long time after Dale left, the envelope clutched in his hands, feeling something shift inside his chest. He had spent 3 years isolated in his grief, convinced that the world had become cold and uncaring. But maybe he had been wrong. That evening brought another surprise visitor. Sarah Chen, who ran the local diner and had known Martha well, appeared at his door with a basket of food. She didn't ask to see the horses, didn't pry into his business. She simply said that she had heard he was busy and might not be taking care of himself properly. The basket contained enough food for several days, all of Martha's favorites, and Henry understood that this was Sarah's way of honoring his late wife's memory. As darkness fell, more people came. Some brought supplies, hay and grain and blankets. Others brought money, crumpled bills and coins saved from their own modest means. Nobody asked for anything in return. By the time night settled over the farm, Henry's kitchen table was covered with offerings from his community. He sat looking at it all, overwhelmed by the generosity that had emerged from what he thought would be his darkest hour. These were not wealthy people. They were farmers and laborers, people who worked hard for every dollar, yet they had come together to help him, to help the horses, because it was the right thing to do. Henry thought about the giant mare in the barn, about how she had gathered orphaned foals and tried to protect them all. Maybe Grace had taught him something about community, about how the strong protect the weak, about how strangers can become family. The next morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it Doc Patterson and his veterinary equipment. The old vet was a tall man with gray hair and steady hands, someone who had spent 40 years caring for animals in the county. He walked into the barn and stopped just as the animal control officers had done, his eyes widening at the sight of Grace and her foals. "Well, Henry, you didn't exaggerate," Patterson said softly. "She's magnificent." He approached slowly, speaking in the calm tones of someone who had earned the trust of countless animals over his career. Patterson spent 3 hours examining each animal thoroughly. He measured Grace, marveling at her size and confirming what Henry had suspected. She was a Shire horse, one of the largest breeds in the world, though even for a Shire she was exceptionally large. The foals were of mixed breeding, Patterson determined, some showing signs of draft horse heritage while others appeared to have lighter bloodlines. None of them matched Grace genetically, which confirmed Henry's theory that she had gathered them from different places. The vet examined Hope with particular care, listening to its breathing and checking its vitals before pronouncing that Henry's treatment had likely saved its life. As Patterson packed up his equipment, he turned to Henry with a serious expression. "I'm going to be honest with you, Henry. These horses are valuable. That mare alone is worth thousands of dollars, possibly tens of thousands to the right buyer. Someone is going to come looking for her eventually. When they do, you need to be prepared for a fight." Henry nodded, having already come to the same conclusion. "What do you think happened to her? Why would she run?" Patterson was quiet for a moment, considering. I've seen cases where horses are abused, neglected, put in situations that break their spirit, but Grace isn't broken. She's protective, maternal, determined. Whatever she ran from, it wasn't something that defeated her. It was something that made her fight. After Patterson left, Henry sat with Grace in the Foals thinking about the veterinarian's words. The barn was quiet except for the soft sounds of the foals nursing and the occasional stamp of Grace's hooves. Henry watched Hope, stronger now but still fragile, nuzzling against Grace's side. He thought about the envelope of money from Dale, about the food from Sarah, about the supplies that kept arriving from neighbors he barely knew. All of these people were investing in a story they believed in, trusting him to do the right thing. That afternoon, Henry decided to do something he had been avoiding. He called the local newspaper. If someone was looking for these horses, they would likely check missing animal reports. But Henry had a story to tell too, and maybe telling it publicly would help protect them. The reporter who answered sounded bored until Henry began describing what he had found in his barn. By the time he finished, the reporter was asking when she could come out for an interview. "Tomorrow," Henry said. "Come tomorrow and I'll tell you everything." As the sun set on the second day of his 72-hour deadline, Henry felt a strange mixture of fear and determination settling into his bones. He had done everything he could think of to document the horse's presence, to establish his claim as their protector. The community had rallied around him in ways he never expected. But the clock was still ticking, and somewhere out there someone might be planning to take Grace and her foals away. Henry looked at the giant mare, at the way she stood guard over her sleeping babies, and he made a silent promise. Whatever happened, whoever came, they would have to go through him first. And this time, he wouldn't be standing alone. The reporter arrived early the next morning, earlier than Henry had expected. Her name was Jessica Torres, and she was young, probably not even 30, with sharp eyes that took in everything around her. She brought a photographer, a quiet man who immediately began circling the property looking for the best angles. Henry led them to the barn with a mixture of nervousness and resolve. He had spent half the night rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain the impossible situation he had found himself in. But when Jessica saw Grace in the Foals, all his prepared words fled his mind. The photographer's camera began clicking immediately, capturing Grace in all her magnificent glory. The mare, accustomed now to Henry's presence but wary of strangers, positioned herself protectively in front of the Foals. Jessica pulled out her notebook and recorder, but for a moment she simply stood there watching. Finally, she turned to Henry with an expression of wonder. "Mr. Mitchell, this is incredible. Can you start from the beginning? Tell me everything." So Henry did. He told her about that foggy morning 4 days ago, about opening the barn door and finding an impossible sight. He told her about the sick foal, about staying up through the nights, about the moment when Grace had helped convince Hope to drink from the bottle. As Henry spoke, Jessica scribbled notes furiously, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the depth of what had happened here. This wasn't just a story about lost horses. This was a story about compassion, about a man who had chosen kindness over convenience, about a community that had rallied around that choice. When Henry mentioned Dale's envelope of money and Sarah's basket of food, Jessica's eyes grew bright with emotion. "These are the kinds of stories people need to hear," she said softly, "especially now, when everything feels so divided. This is about people coming together." The photographer asked if he could get some shots of Henry with Grace and the Foals. Henry agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable being the center of attention. But as he stood next to Grace, with Hope and the other foals gathered around his feet, something felt right about it. This wasn't about seeking glory or recognition. This was about showing the world that these animals mattered, that they deserved protection. The photographer took dozens of pictures, and with each click of the shutter, Henry felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. Once this story was published, there would be no going back. The whole world would know about Grace and her foals. After the interview concluded and Jessica and the photographer had left, Henry found himself sitting in the barn, his back against a support beam, watching the foals play. They had grown so much in just a few days. Even Hope, though still smaller than the others, was joining in their games now, chasing Scout around the barn with surprising energy. Grace stood nearby, and every so often she would glance toward Henry with an expression that he had come to recognize. It was gratitude, mixed with something else, trust, perhaps, or friendship. Whatever it was, it warmed something deep in Henry's chest that had been cold for a very long time. The article appeared in the newspaper the following morning, spread across the entire front page. The headline read, "Local Farmer Becomes Guardian to Mysterious Mare and 10 Orphaned Foals." The photograph they had chosen showed Henry standing beside Grace, his weathered hand resting on her massive shoulder, while the foals clustered around them. Henry hardly recognized himself in the picture. The man in the photograph looked determined, purposeful, younger somehow than Henry felt most days. Martha would have loved this, he thought, tracing her memory through his mind like a prayer. The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. By 9 in the morning, Henry's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters from larger newspapers and television stations wanted interviews. Animal welfare organizations offered support and resources. People from across the state called just to say they had read the story and it had moved them, but among the supportive calls came others, ones that made Henry's blood run cold. Several claimed to know where the horses had come from. One man insisted they had been stolen from his property. Another woman said she recognized Grace from a photograph and demanded her return. Each claim felt like a knife to Henry's heart. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived around noon, his expression grim. "Henry, we need to talk. Several people have come forward claiming ownership of these horses. We're going to have to investigate each claim." Henry felt panic rising in his chest. "How long will that take?" Tom shrugged. "Could be days, could be weeks. In the meantime, the horses stay here with you. But Henry, if someone can prove legitimate ownership, there's nothing I can do. The law is the law." Henry understood what Tom wasn't saying. The 72-hour grace period was about to end, and soon the real battle would begin. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A sleek black car pulled up to Henry's property, so out of place among the trucks and dirt roads that Henry knew immediately this was trouble. From the car stepped a man in an expensive suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, completely impractical for a farm. Behind him came another man, larger and harder looking, clearly some kind of bodyguard or assistant. The man in the suit approached Henry with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell? My name is Richard Thornwood. I believe you have my horses." Henry felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "Your horses?" Thornwood nodded, pulling out a leather folder. "I own Thornwood Estates, one of the premier breeding facilities in the tri-state area. That mare you're harboring is named Athena, and she's worth over $50,000. She was stolen from my facility 2 weeks ago, along with several valuable foals. I have all the documentation right here." He held out papers toward Henry, who made no move to take them. Henry's mind was racing. 2 weeks ago, that meant Grace, or Athena as this man called her, had been traveling for 2 weeks with these foals running from this place. "What did you do to her?" Henry asked, his voice low and dangerous. Thornwood's smile faltered slightly. "I beg your pardon? What did you do that made her run?" Henry stepped closer, not caring about the bodyguard who tensed nearby. "She showed up here terrified and desperate, protecting foals that weren't even hers." Animals don't run like that unless they have a reason. So I'll ask you again, what did you do to her? Thornwood's expression hardened. I did nothing except provide her with top-quality care and breeding services. She was being prepared for a very important breeding program. The foals she brought with her were scheduled for sale. This whole situation has cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. Breeding program, Henry repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. You mean you were using her, forcing her to breed, taking her babies and selling them? Thornwood drew himself up indignantly. I run a legitimate business, Mr. Mitchell. Everything I do is perfectly legal, and those horses belong to me. I will be returning with the sheriff tomorrow to claim my property. Henry felt something break inside him, but it wasn't weakness. It was the final restraint on his determination. Those horses aren't going anywhere with you. I don't care what your papers say. You'll have to prove you're a fit owner first. The confrontation might have escalated if Sheriff Bradley hadn't arrived at that moment, responding to a call from Dale, who had seen the expensive car and suspected trouble. Tom stepped between Henry and Thornwood, his hands raised. Gentlemen, let's all calm down. Mr. Thornwood, if you're claiming ownership, you'll need to file the proper paperwork and submit to an investigation. That's the law. Mr. Mitchell has filed a found animal report, which gives him temporary custody. Thornwood looked furious but controlled himself. Fine. I'll go through the proper channels, but Sheriff, I want to make something very clear. Those are my horses, I have the documentation to prove it, and I will be taking them back, one way or another. After Thornwood left, Tom pulled Henry aside. I have to tell you, Henry, if his paperwork is in order, there's nothing I can do. The law will side with the documented owner. Unless you can prove he abused those horses, and I mean prove it with evidence, not just speculation. Henry felt despair threatening to overwhelm him. How am I supposed to prove that? Tom sighed heavily. I don't know, Henry. I honestly don't know. But you've got maybe a week before the courts decide. If I were you, I'd use that time wisely. That evening, Henry sat in the barn with Grace, who seemed to sense his distress. She had moved closer to him than usual, her massive body providing a wall of warmth and comfort. The foals were all sleeping, exhausted from another day of play and growth. Henry thought about Thornwood's words, about breeding programs and sales, about treating these magnificent creatures as nothing more than inventory. He looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully now, so different from the sick and dying foal he had found days ago. He thought about Grace's desperate eyes when he first saw her, about the trust she had placed in him. I won't let him take you back there, Henry whispered into the darkness. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. Grace turned her head and looked at him with those deep, intelligent eyes. In that moment, Henry felt she understood every word, understood that he was making a promise he might not be able to keep, but he would try. God help him, he would try with everything he had. The war had begun, and Henry Mitchell, a simple farmer with no money and few resources, was standing against a wealthy businessman with the law on his side. The odds were impossible, but looking at Grace and her foals, Henry knew he had no choice but to fight. Henry spent the next 2 days desperately searching for answers. He called every animal welfare organization he could find, spoke with lawyers who offered free consultations, and spent hours on the internet in the town library researching Thornwood Estates. What he discovered made his stomach turn. Thornwood's facility was indeed legitimate on paper, properly licensed and inspected. But digging deeper into online forums and social media, Henry found whispers and rumors. Former employees who spoke anonymously about overcrowded conditions, about mares forced to breed too frequently, about foals separated from their mothers far too young. None of it was concrete evidence, just shadows and suggestions that something wasn't right behind the pristine facade. On the 3rd day after Thornwood's visit, something unexpected happened. A young woman appeared at Henry's door, her clothes worn and her eyes red from crying. Her name was Maria Santos, and she had driven 3 hours after seeing the newspaper article about Grace and the Foals. When Henry invited her in, she pulled out her phone with trembling hands and showed him photographs. The pictures showed Grace, younger and healthier, standing in a field with a foal by her side. "I worked at Thornwood Estates for 2 years," Maria said, her voice shaking. "I quit 3 weeks ago because I couldn't stand what they were doing to the horses. That mare, the one you call Grace, her name there was Athena. She was the gentlest giant I'd ever met." Maria's story poured out in a rush of words held back too long. She described how Thornwood pushed his breeding program to extremes, how mares were bred season after season without adequate rest, how foals were torn from their mothers and sold before they were properly weaned. Athena had given birth to a beautiful filly, Maria explained through tears, but complications during birth meant she couldn't breed again for at least a year. Thornwood was furious. He said she was useless to him if she couldn't produce foals. "I heard him tell the handlers to sell her for meat." Maria's words struck Henry like a physical blow. Sell her for meat? A magnificent animal like Grace? The cruelty of it was incomprehensible. But that wasn't all Maria had to tell. She explained that several other mares at the facility had given birth around the same time as Athena, and when Thornwood realized Athena couldn't breed again, he reassigned her foals to other mares to maximize his sales. Athena was devastated. "I've never seen an animal grieve like that," Maria said. "She stopped eating, stopped caring. We all thought she would die of a broken heart. Then one night, there was a storm. The power went out, and in the chaos, someone left a gate unlocked. When we checked the next morning, Athena was gone, and so were 10 foals from different pens. She had somehow gathered them all and escaped." Henry listened to this story with growing horror and understanding. Grace hadn't just been running away from abuse. She had been saving these foals, taking on the role of mother to babies who had lost their own mothers to Thornwood's cruel practices. The depth of her courage and compassion overwhelmed him. "Maria, why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you report it to authorities?" Maria looked down at her hands. "I was afraid. Thornwood has money and lawyers. He threatened anyone who spoke against him with lawsuits we couldn't afford. But when I saw that photograph in the newspaper, saw Athena safe with those foals, I knew I had to do something. I can't let him take her back there. I just can't." Henry immediately called Sheriff Bradley and asked him to come listen to Maria's testimony. But when Tom arrived and heard the story, his expression was sympathetic but not hopeful. "Maria, I believe you. But without physical evidence, without documentation, this is just your word against Thornwood's. He has breeding records, purchase documents, registration papers. Unless we can find concrete proof of abuse or neglect, the court will side with the legal owner." Maria's face crumpled. "There are others who feel the way I do. Other former employees. Maybe if we all spoke up together." Tom nodded slowly. "That might help. Gather as many people as you can who are willing to testify. It's not a guarantee, but it's something." Over the next 3 days, Maria worked tirelessly to contact former Thornwood employees. Some were too afraid to come forward, frightened of Thornwood's reputation for vindictive lawsuits. But others, inspired by Maria's courage and moved by the newspaper article about Henry and Grace, agreed to make statements. By the end of the week, Sheriff Bradley had testimonies from 6 former employees, all describing conditions at Thornwood Estates that ranged from questionable to clearly abusive. It still wasn't enough to definitely win the case, but it was a foundation to build on. Tom filed a request with the court to delay the custody hearing, citing the need to investigate allegations of animal cruelty. Meanwhile, the story had taken on a life of its own. The newspaper article had been picked up by larger outlets, and soon Grace's story was being shared across social media by animal lovers worldwide. Donations began pouring in to help Henry with legal fees and care costs for the horses. People sent letters of support. some from as far away as Europe and Australia, all expressing their hope that Grace and the Foals would be allowed to stay with Henry. The global attention put pressure on Thornwood in ways he hadn't anticipated. His business's reputation was being questioned publicly, and several high-profile clients began distancing themselves from Thornwood Estates. But Thornwood wasn't backing down. He hired an expensive legal team and filed counterclaims, accusing Henry of theft and demanding immediate return of his property plus damages. The legal battle became increasingly complex, with motions and countermotions flying back and forth. Henry found himself spending more time with lawyers than with the horses, trying to understand legal jargon that made his head spin. The stress was taking its toll on him. He wasn't sleeping well, wasn't eating properly, and the worry showed in the new lines on his face and the gray pallor of his skin. Through all of this, Grace remained a steady presence. She seemed to understand that something was wrong, that the humans around her were fighting over her fate. Sometimes Henry would find her standing at the barn door looking out toward the road as if watching for danger. Other times she would approach him and rest her head on his shoulder, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. The Foals, now thriving under Henry's care, had no understanding of the precarious nature of their situation. They played and nursed and grew, innocent of the legal battle being waged over their future. One evening, as Henry sat in the barn exhausted from another day of legal consultations, Dale came by with news. The community had organized something special for the upcoming weekend. "We're having a rally," Dale explained. "Right here on your property, if you'll allow it. People want to show their support for you and the horses. We're calling it Grace's Stand." Henry was moved beyond words. The community that he had thought had forgotten him, that he had isolated himself from after Martha's death, was coming together not just to support him, but to fight for these animals who had captured everyone's hearts. The rally took place on a sunny Saturday morning, and the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Hundreds of people showed up carrying signs that read, "Save Grace and keep families together," and "One farmer's courage." There were speeches from local officials, testimonies from Maria and the other former Thornwood employees, and even a veterinarian who spoke about the psychological damage that separating foals from their mothers could cause. News cameras captured everything, broadcasting the event to a watching world. Henry stood next to Grace's stall, overwhelmed by the sea of support surrounding him, and for the first time since this battle began, he felt genuine hope. But that hope was tempered by reality. 2 days after the rally, Henry received notice that the custody hearing had been scheduled. In 1 week, a judge would decide Grace's fate. Thornwood's lawyers had submitted their evidence, registration papers, breeding records, purchase receipts. Everything was in order, all perfectly legal. Henry's lawyers countered with the testimonies from former employees and documentation of Grace's condition when she arrived, showing signs of stress and inadequate care. They argued that Thornwood had forfeited his right to ownership through neglect and abuse. But would it be enough? Nobody knew. As the hearing date approached, Henry spent every moment he could with Grace and the Foals. He talked to them constantly, telling them about the fight he was waging, about all the people who cared about them, about his promise to keep them safe. Hope, fully recovered now and growing stronger each day, had become particularly attached to Henry. The little foal followed him everywhere, and Henry found comfort in its trusting presence. These animals had changed his life, had given him purpose and community and a reason to keep fighting. He couldn't imagine his barn without them, couldn't imagine waking up to silence instead of Grace's welcoming nicker. The night before the hearing, Henry couldn't sleep. He paced his house, then finally gave up and went to the barn. Grace was awake, as if she had been waiting for him. He sat beside her in the hay, and she lowered her massive body to rest beside him, something she had never done before. They sat together in the darkness, man and horse, connected by a bond that transcended species. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Henry whispered, "I want you to know that you saved me just as much as I tried to save you. You reminded me what it means to care about something beyond myself. Thank you for that." Grace turned her head and gently nuzzled his shoulder, and in that moment, Henry felt a peace settle over him. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight they were together, and that was enough. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity on the morning of the hearing. People lined the hallways and spilled out onto the courthouse steps, all wanting to witness the outcome of the case that had captured the nation's attention. Henry arrived early with Dale and Sarah, his hands shaking as he climbed the stone steps. He wore the only suit he owned, the same one he had worn to Martha's funeral, and it felt tight and uncomfortable after hanging unused for 3 years. Inside the courtroom, he took his seat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyers who had agreed to work on a reduced fee thanks to the community fundraising. Across the aisle sat Richard Thornwood, looking confident and composed in an expensive tailored suit. His legal team consisted of 4 lawyers, each carrying briefcases stuffed with documents. Thornwood glanced at Henry once, a dismissive look that suggested he viewed this entire proceeding as a formality, before he reclaimed what he considered his property. Behind Thornwood sat several well-dressed individuals who Henry assumed were investors or business partners, there to show support for their associate. The contrast between the two sides couldn't have been more stark: wealth and power versus humble determination. Judge Margaret Chen entered the courtroom and everyone rose. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, but also for strictly following the law. Henry's lawyer had warned him that this was both good and bad. Good because she wouldn't be swayed by Thornwood's money or influence. Bad because the law technically supported Thornwood's claim of ownership. As the judge took her seat and called the court to order, Henry felt his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Everything he had fought for over the past weeks came down to the next few hours. Thornwood's lead attorney, a polished man named Gerald Ashford, presented his case first. He laid out the documentation with practiced efficiency: registration papers for Athena showing Thornwood as the breeder and owner, breeding records documenting her lineage and value, and receipts for the various foals that had been in his facility. He presented testimony from Thornwood's current employees, all praising the conditions at Thornwood Estates and describing the facility as a model operation. Ashford painted Henry as a well-meaning but misguided man who had unknowingly harbored stolen property and now refused to return it due to emotional attachment. When it was the defense's turn, Henry's attorney, a younger woman named Rebecca Martinez, stood with quiet confidence. She called Maria Santos to the stand first. Maria, visibly nervous, recounted her time at Thornwood Estates with trembling but honest words. She described the breeding practices, the premature separation of foals from mothers, and most importantly, Thornwood's order to send Athena to slaughter after she could no longer breed immediately. Under cross-examination, Ashford tried to paint Maria as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, but Maria held firm. She had no reason to lie, she insisted. She simply couldn't stay silent while animals suffered. 5 more former employees testified, each adding their voices to the growing picture of systematic neglect and abuse. Some cried on the stand, recounting specific incidents that had haunted them since leaving Thornwood's employment. One woman described watching foals cry for their mothers night after night, the sound keeping her awake until she finally quit. A man testified about being ordered to use harsh training methods on horses that showed spirit, breaking them down until they became compliant. With each testimony, Henry watched Thornwood's confident expression begin to crack, replaced by barely concealed anger. Then Rebecca called Dr. Patterson to the stand. The veterinarian presented his findings from examining Grace and the foals. He testified that Grace showed signs of chronic stress and inadequate nutrition when she arrived at Henry's farm. though she had clearly been well-bred stock originally. More significantly, he testified about the psychological state of the mare. "In my 40 years of practice," Dr. Patterson stated, "I have never seen a horse display such strong protective and maternal behavior toward foals that weren't biologically hers. This suggests deep trauma from previous separations combined with an extraordinary capacity for empathy. Animals don't gather orphans unless they understand loss. Grace understood loss." The testimony that broke the courtroom's composure came from an unexpected source. A young woman who hadn't been on the witness list stood up from the gallery and asked permission to speak. Judge Chen, intrigued, allowed it. The woman identified herself as Emily Thornwood, Richard Thornwood's daughter. The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible, and Richard Thornwood's face went white. Emily, barely 20 years old, approached the stand with her father's eyes following her every move. She testified that she had grown up at Thornwood Estates, that she had loved the horses more than anything. But over the years, she had watched her father's business practices become increasingly cruel, driven by profit over animal welfare. "I begged him to stop," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "I told him we were hurting them, that we needed to give the mares more time between breeding, that we couldn't keep taking foals from their mothers so young. But he wouldn't listen. When Athena escaped with those foals, I was relieved. I hoped she would find somewhere safe. When I saw the newspaper article about Mr. Mitchell, I knew she had." Under questioning, Emily revealed that she had been the one who had called in the anonymous tip to animal control, not to get the horses taken away, but to ensure they were being properly cared for. She had also been the one who unlocked Athena's gate the night of the storm. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Thornwood lunged toward his daughter, shouting betrayal, before being restrained by bailiffs. Judge Chen slammed her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the room finally quieted, she ordered a 30-minute recess to allow everyone to compose themselves. During that break, Henry saw Emily approach Thornwood, trying to speak with him, but her father turned his back on her completely. The pain on the young woman's face was heartbreaking, and Henry felt deep sadness for her. She had chosen what was right over her own family, a sacrifice he understood all too well. When court reconvened, Judge Chen looked tired but resolute. She had clearly spent the recess reviewing all the evidence and testimony. "Before I render my decision," she began, "I want to address something that has become clear during these proceedings. This case is about more than property rights. It's about our responsibility to the creatures we claim dominion over. Mr. Thornwood, your documentation of ownership is impeccable. Under normal circumstances, the law would require me to return the horses to you immediately. However, the testimony presented today paints a picture of systematic abuse and neglect that cannot be ignored." Judge Chen continued, her voice growing stronger. "The fact that your own daughter testified against you, that multiple former employees corroborated stories of cruel practices, and that a licensed veterinarian found evidence of chronic stress and malnutrition, these factors compel me to look beyond simple ownership papers. Additionally, Ms. Thornwood's testimony that she deliberately assisted in the horse's escape complicates your claim. One cannot claim theft when a family member with access deliberately facilitated the animal's departure. Therefore, I am making the following ruling. The horses will remain in the custody of Henry Mitchell under a protective order while the state conducts a full investigation of Thornwood Estates." The courtroom exploded with cheers and applause. Henry felt his knees go weak with relief, and Dale had to steady him to keep him from collapsing. But Judge Chen wasn't finished. She slammed her gavel again for silence. "Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney for potential criminal charges of animal cruelty. Mr. Thornwood, until the investigation is complete, and assuming Mr. Mitchell continues to provide adequate care, those horses will not be returned to you, And if the investigation confirms what has been testified here today, you will permanently forfeit all rights to these animals. This court is adjourned." As the gavel fell one final time, Henry felt tears streaming down his face. Around him, people were celebrating, hugging, crying with joy. He looked across the courtroom and saw Emily Thornwood standing alone, watching her father storm out without a backward glance. Henry made his way through the crowd and approached her. The young woman looked at him with red eyes full of pain and hope. "Thank you," Henry said simply. "What you did took incredible courage." Emily nodded, unable to speak. Henry hugged her, this girl who had sacrificed her family for what was right, and whispered, "They're safe now. Because of you, they're safe." She buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed, and Henry let her cry, understanding that sometimes doing the right thing cost more than anyone should have to pay. 6 months passed, and autumn painted Henry's farm in shades of gold and crimson. The investigation into Thornwood Estates had concluded with devastating results for Richard Thornwood. The authorities had found extensive evidence of animal cruelty, financial fraud, and violations of breeding regulations. Thornwood lost his business license, faced criminal charges, and was banned from owning horses. The facility was shut down, and the remaining horses were rehomed to sanctuaries and responsible owners. Justice, though long in coming, had finally arrived. For Henry, those 6 months had been transformative. The farm that had once felt empty and purposeless now bustled with life and activity. Grace and her 10 foals, now legally and permanently his, had grown stronger and healthier with each passing day. Hope, the foal that had been so sick when they arrived, was now indistinguishable from the others in health and vitality. Scout still led adventurous expeditions around the property, Shadow still appeared suddenly from unexpected places, and Stella, though still the gentlest, had developed a confident streak that made Henry smile. Each foal had developed into a unique individual with quirks and personalities that enriched Henry's life in ways he had never imagined. The community support that had emerged during the trial hadn't faded. Instead, it had grown into something lasting and beautiful. Dale and several other neighbors had helped Henry expand his barn and build new paddocks, so the horses had more room to exercise and play. Sarah organized weekly volunteer days where people came to help with farm chores, mucking stalls and mending fences, all while enjoying the company of the horses. The farm had become an informal gathering place, a reminder of what people could accomplish when they came together for a common purpose. Children from the local school took field trips to visit the horses, learning about compassion and responsibility through Grace's story. Emily Thornwood had become a regular presence on the farm. After testifying against her father, she had been disowned by him, cut off financially and emotionally, but the community that had embraced Henry had embraced her as well. She had moved to a small apartment in town and found work at a local veterinary clinic, finally free to pursue her passion for animal welfare without her father's cruel influence. She visited the farm several times a week, and Henry had come to think of her as the daughter he and Martha had never had. Emily had a special bond with Grace, and the giant mare would always walk to the fence when she saw Emily's car coming up the drive, as if recognizing the young woman who had set her free. The transformation in Grace herself was perhaps the most remarkable. Gone was the fearful, stressed animal that had appeared in Henry's barn that foggy morning. In her place stood a confident, peaceful mare who had found her sanctuary. She remained fiercely protective of her foals, but now that protectiveness came from love rather than fear. She trusted Henry completely, would follow him anywhere, and had developed a gentle playfulness that Doc Patterson said he had rarely seen in draft horses. Sometimes Henry would find her standing at the paddock fence looking out over the valley with what he could only describe as contentment in her expression. As for Henry himself, the lonely, grieving widower who had been slowly fading from the world had been replaced by a man with purpose and community. He had lost weight from all the physical work, gained color in his cheeks from spending so much time outdoors, and found himself laughing more than he had in years. The house that had been silent since Martha's death now regularly hosted dinners with Dale, Sarah, Emily, and other friends. They would gather around his kitchen table, sharing food and stories, and Henry would look around at these faces and feel Martha's presence in the warmth and connection. She would have loved this, he often thought. She would have loved all of it. One crisp October morning, as Henry was distributing breakfast to the horses, he noticed Grace behaving strangely. She was pacing the paddock, occasionally looking toward the barn and nickering. Henry's heart jumped with worry, memories of Hope's illness flooding back. But as he approached, he realized Grace wasn't distressed. She was excited. Following her gaze, he saw why. Standing at the barn entrance were Scout and 3 of the other foals, and Scout was taking his first tentative steps outside the paddock fence, exploring the greater farm on his own. Grace was letting go, allowing her babies to begin their journey toward independence. Henry watched this scene with tears in his eyes, understanding the significance of what he was witnessing. Grace had saved these foals, had fought to keep them safe, had trusted Henry to help her protect them. And now, secure in the knowledge that they were truly safe, she was beginning to release them into their own lives. It was the natural order of things, the cycle of growth and independence that all parents must eventually embrace. Henry thought about Martha, about how she had always encouraged him to remain connected to their community, even as his natural inclination was toward solitude. Martha had known that love meant sometimes letting go, sometimes trusting others, sometimes accepting help. Grace was teaching him the same lesson now. The days grew shorter as winter approached, but the farm never felt dark. The barn glowed with warmth and life, horses and humans alike finding comfort in the shared space. Henry had started a journal, something he had never done before, documenting the daily lives of Grace and the foals. He wrote about Scout's adventures and Shadow's mysterious appearances. He wrote about Hope's complete recovery, a living testament to the power of care and determination. He wrote about the community that had saved him as surely as he had saved the horses. And he wrote letters to Martha, telling her about everything she was missing, believing somehow that she knew, that she approved, that she had perhaps even orchestrated this entire miracle. On Christmas Eve, Henry hosted the largest gathering his farm had ever seen. Over 100 people came, bringing food and gifts and joy. They sang carols in the barn while the horses watched with patient curiosity. Children decorated Grace and the foals with ribbons and bells, and the giant mare tolerated it with amusement, occasionally stealing treats from pockets when the children giggled. Emily was there with her new boyfriend, a kind veterinary student who looked at her with obvious adoration. Dale and Sarah stood together, having discovered romance of their own during the long months of supporting Henry. The barn was filled with laughter and music, and the warmth of people who had become family. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Henry found himself alone with Grace one final time before bed. The mare approached him in the quiet barn, now empty except for the 2 of them and the sleeping foals. She lowered her massive head and pressed it against Henry's chest, just as she had done that first morning when everything had changed. Henry wrapped his arms around her neck, feeling the steady beat of her heart, the warmth of her breath, the solid reality of her presence. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for choosing my barn. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for reminding me what it means to love something beyond myself." Grace simply stood there, accepting his gratitude, offering her own silent thanks in return. In that moment, Henry understood something profound. He had thought he was saving Grace and the foals, but the truth was far more complex and beautiful. They had saved each other. Grace had given Henry purpose, community, and a reason to rejoin the world. Henry had given Grace and her foals safety, care, and a permanent home. Together, They had created something neither could have achieved alone, a family born not of blood, but of choice, sacrifice, and unconditional love. As Henry walked back to his house that night, he paused and looked back at the barn. Through the windows he could see Grace standing guard over her sleeping foals, forever the protector, forever the mother. The sight filled him with such profound gratitude that he had to stop and compose himself. This farm, these animals, this community, this life he hadn't planned for or sought out but had been given anyway. It was more than he deserved, more than he had dared to hope for. It was grace itself in every sense of the word. The stars shone bright in the winter sky as Henry climbed the steps to his porch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of connection and growth. But tonight, on this perfect Christmas Eve, with his barn full of horses who had chosen him just as he had chosen them, Henry Mitchell was exactly where he belonged. He was home, truly home, for the first time since Martha had left him, and as he turned off the porch light and looked one last time toward the barn, he could have sworn he heard Martha's voice on the wind, whispering the words she had always said when life surprised them with unexpected blessings. "See, Henry? See how much love there is in the world? You just have to be brave enough to let it in."